Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. A financial injection for the tech sector, inviting more foreign investment. China sets out plans to fire up the economy.
Our other headlines, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky joins an emergency EU summit to discuss an $840 billion plan to boost defence.
President Trump pauses tariffs on Canadian and Mexican car makers the day after the 25% levy was imposed.
German bonds suffered their worst day since 1990 as the incoming Chancellor says he'll increase defence spending.
Yes, a Formula One car is fast, but it's not a patch on what happens inside these.
And wiring the future, how high-tech cables are powering the artificial intelligence revolution.
China will mobilise billions of dollars to support emerging tech firms and wants more foreign investment. Some of the key messages from Beijing as the country's top legislators gather to set out their plans.
A $140 billion fund will support tech startups. Lawmakers also promised more market reform and stressed that China's 5% GDP growth target is realistic.
Our correspondent Jen Copestake is in Beijing.
A rather long press conference at just under 2.5 hours, and we heard from numerous top officials there. We heard that the chairman of China's National Development and Reform Commission, Zheng Chai-shih, said he was confident that China is going to meet this growth target, the GDP growth target of 5%. He reiterated what we've been hearing here in the last couple of days, that China has a solid economic foundation and that despite internal and external challenges to the economy, everything would be fine to reach that target. Finance Minister Len Fowen said that China had ample tools in reserve to deal with any possible external and domestic uncertainties that may arise. He said the government also has policy tools to play with, so it will be able to successfully reach 5% GDP growth. Now, the officials said that more stimulus measures can be used if needed. People's Bank of China Governor Pan Gong-shen said at an appropriate time it would cut interest rates and also cut the amount of money that banks are required to hold in reserve. The officials said it was a priority for them to keep the yuan stable at a reasonable and balanced level. Now, all of this comes as China continues to face a trade war with the U.S., with America increasing tariffs on Chinese imports to 20%. Commerce Minister Wang Wantao was asked about retaliatory tariffs and if the conflict between China and the U.S. would be prolonged. Now, he said that the U.S. is distorting the truth about China's involvement in America's fentanyl drug crisis, saying that protectionism is a dead end. And Minister Wang said that he's willing to meet his American counterparts at what he called an appropriate time. We also heard from the head of China's Securities Regulatory Commission, who said that China will accelerate a new round of capital market reform and opening up. This will also enhance the healthy development of the stock market. He said that China would deepen the effectiveness of supervision and law enforcement while improving coordination between investment and financing, development and promoting adaptability in the market's fundamental institutions.
Jen, briefly, a lot of focus on this new fund to support tech enterprises.
That's right. There was quite a few questions from the journalists who were present about how tech companies are going to be funded in the future in China. And the officials actually joked that this was becoming more of a tech conference than an economic press conference. So, yes, China announced a new fund. It's called the State Venture Capital Guidance Fund to encourage high-tech innovation in fields like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and energy storage. Now, this will see the expansion, the doubling of a re-lending facility for the tech sector that did sit at $69 billion. This will go up to $138 billion of investment over the next 20 years. The central bank governor said foreign investment in tech companies also is going to be encouraged, and he welcomes international investors to invest in China's high-tech firms. He said China is going to oppose any imposition of unjust investment barriers. This is perhaps a nod to the US's recent restrictions on tech going into China. So spending on tech is going to increase by 8.3% on last year. That will be over $165 billion. And China's security regulator, Wu Qing, said that the surprise success of artificial intelligence startup DeepSeek had led to re-evaluations of China's tech stock prices.
Well, let's talk now to Anthony Chan, who's a former global chief economist at JP Morgan Chase. Welcome to the programme. Thank you for joining us. So do you think that these measures being announced are the right ones? Will they do the job of helping China's economy meet its targets?
Yeah, I'm actually pretty confident because it's a multi-pronged approach in which China is going to really use its policies, tools, and certainly has some plans for longer term to keep growth on a sustainable basis. So I do think they have the right tools. The question is when and how and when they will execute them.
Well, let's dig into that. We have heard a lot about consumption in these meetings. How is China going to kickstart that consumption it's after and convince people to start spending?
Well, I think they already are, in fact, making those plans. They're certainly going to enhance the public safety net to basically make people feel very comfortable that somehow if they spend, they're going to be fine. I think that stimulating with targeted fiscal policy programs is the right way to go. The trade-in for appliances, for electric vehicles, all that is going to boost consumption. Remember that boosting consumption is the right way to go because there is some uncertainty with regard to the outside or the trade sector. So to boost consumption would be the right way to go to ensure that you get that 5% economic growth. So boosting consumption and stimulating consumption is certainly a viable option for China.
Well, you mentioned uncertainty, particularly in the trade sector. What about those external challenges that tariffs throw up? What can China put in place to deal with these?
Well, I think that in the short term, it is unfortunate. It raises uncertainty. But I think China longer term has already taken steps to diversify its trading partners. That means that it's not just going to rely on one country, say the United States. It's certainly going to look at some of the global south, a lot of countries in Asia. It's going to look at Latin America. It's going to also look at Europe. So it is going to move in diversification and also willing to talk to make sure that these trade uncertainties sort of dissipate with more engagement on both sides.
We did have some news on interest rates. The People's Bank of China saying it wants to cut them, as well as the reserve ratio for banks. How much do you think it will cut, and when might it do it?
I think it's waiting to see the resolution of this trade uncertainty and to see whether or not it's going to intensify, whether it's short term. But I think the interest rate, the policy rate, the 1 year rate can easily be cut anywhere from 20 to 30 basis points. I certainly think that China will, in fact, engage and lower the reserve requirement ratio because that, again, frees up money for banks to companies in China to spend more money. And by the way, they could also make provide more liquidity or more loans to the commercial banks so they can lend. So there are many policy tools that the central bank has to ensure that economic growth moves towards 5%, not to mention the other factors that we mentioned, like fiscal policy. So there are many, many policy levers that the Chinese government can, in fact, use to ensure you get that 5% growth. That's why I'm so confident that they will get 5% growth this year.
Anthony, great to talk to you. Thank you for coming on the programme. That's Anthony Chan, former global chief economist at JP Morgan Chase.
And China's tech growth will be part of a special programme this weekend here on CGTN. Juliet Mann speaks to Xiaoshan Liu from the Shenzhen Institute of Artificial Intelligence and Robotics for Society, who says China is living through a golden age of technology.
The golden era for tech in China right now, for several reasons. For the first reason, the tech infrastructure is ready. Before, I think a few years back, if you talk about tech, Chinese companies rely on, for example, in mobile computing, relies on Android platform, which is coming from the United States. For other areas, for chip area, it rely on Intel, NVIDIA, and other chip manufacturers. But if you examine the tech infrastructure today, for deep learning, we have DeepSeek. Then for chip manufacturing, we have Huawei and other companies. It's an independent tech infrastructure. And the second reason is the state is pouring tons and tons of resources into tech, so that as an entrepreneur in the space, it's easier to secure funding compared to a few years back. And the third reason is that China is opening up from the 2 session. The central government is sending a very strong message that China is opening up, whether it's opening up its own market or opening up to explore foreign markets as well. So combining those 3 factors, I think it's a golden era for tech in China right now.
EU leaders discussing an $840 billion plan to boost defence and further support Ukraine at an emergency meeting in Brussels.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked Europe for staying with Kyiv in the past week, during which he clashed with President Trump. Washington paused military aid and suspended intelligence sharing.
We're very thankful that we are not alone, and these are not just words, we feel it. It's very important. You made a strong signal to Ukrainian people, to Ukrainian warriors, to civilians, to all our families, and it's great that we are not alone. We feel it and we know it. Thank you so much for everything.
Our correspondent Will Denslow is in Brussels. So Will, what's come out of this meeting so far?
Well, we've heard from Volodymyr Zelensky after his roundtable discussion with the EU's 27 leaders, and he said that what was discussed was immediate guarantees when it came to Ukraine, things like ammunition, things like air defence systems to be increased. Of course, we know that the EU has been planning to send roughly 1.5 million rounds of ammunition to Ukraine. He said there was also discussion on things like Ukraine's accession to the EU, which has been something on the table for quite some time. A big question is whether there will be unanimous buy-in from the EU's 27 member states. Hungary is one country that has been resistant to providing more military support for Ukraine. Viktor Orban, the country's prime minister, has suggested in the past that believes that more military support for Ukraine could be detrimental to US efforts to reach a peace agreement with Moscow. Another major issue that's been discussed here at this summit is Europe's collective security. We know that this week the Commission has submitted a proposal to the tune of $840 billion to boost Europe's defence capabilities. That has been a massive area that's been discussed. Many European leaders say they are in favour of some of the flexibility that it provides. We've also heard from Roberta Metsola, the President of the European Parliament. She says it's about damn time that Europe stands on its own 2 feet when it comes to defence and collective security.
And Will, another topic likely on the table, President Macron's idea of extending the French nuclear deterrence.
That's absolutely right. In response to some of those comments made by Emmanuel Macron on Wednesday evening, we've had some reaction from a few European leaders. We've heard from Lithuania's president, who described it as a very interesting idea. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk has come out and says that it's an interesting proposal as well. We've also heard from Mette Frederiksen, the Danish Prime Minister. She said that it's not something that Denmark is actively looking at, but she said to the press that she's not going to say no to any proposals. That really gives a sense of the nature of this meeting, that the European Union is looking to pull any levers at its disposal to boost not only Europe's wider collective security, but what it can do to provide more long-term assurances for its ally in Kyiv.
Will, thank you very much. Our correspondent William Denslow in Brussels.
Well, as we've been hearing, this new United States administration is forcing Europe's leaders to rethink their defence. Many European states belong to NATO, the military alliance which includes the United States and Canada. NATO says its members should spend at least 2% of their GDP on defence. But for years, Europe has failed to meet that target. Our correspondent Michael Murillier has the story. Michael.
Jamie, thank you very much. So why is Europe rushing to arm itself? Let's look at its budgets, specifically its defense budgets. We'll start with 2014, the year the conflict between Ukraine and Russia first broke out. EU states should have spent $314 billion on defense. That's if they followed NATO's guidelines. This is what they actually spent, $195 billion, less than two-thirds of that target. Now, Donald Trump called for more defense spending in his first term as US president. It seems that had an impact, but there was still a gap. By 2022, NATO guidelines called for nearly $362 billion. EU members spent $272 billion. Now, some of that spending, directly or indirectly, has gone towards support for Ukraine. And that's one of the reasons that line is starting to spike. EU countries spent nearly $350 billion on defense last year. The target was roughly $370 billion. Again, that's if they followed NATO's advice. What does all that mean? Well, EU states spent 1.9% of GDP, so just short of the 2% target. So we have seen progress, but it's been uneven. Poland spent over 4% of its GDP on defense last year. That's a bigger proportion than anyone else in the alliance. Germany is Europe's largest economy. It spent 2.1%, so just above that NATO target. And then you have Spain with just under 1.3%. So what is going on here? Well, this could be a factor. Poland shares a border with Ukraine, while Spain is 4,000 kilometers from the front line. Different countries approach the issue in different ways, and that's the challenge facing European states. In the past, they could count on the US to fill any gaps, but Trump says he's no longer willing to underwrite those shortfalls. The bottom line, Europe will have to reassess its priorities when it comes to spending. Jamie, Robin?
Michael, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Michael Murillier. So what is the view in Europe when it comes to defence?
I'm not feeling safe because of this American, or mostly Trump, presidency. It's not seems to be professional at all.
I'm not in a danger right now, but yeah, I don't know if it's still gonna remain in the future.
Donald Trump being as the president of the United States now is a good wake-up call for the whole Europe, and we have to make sure that we understand that we stand on our foot now.
We need to spend more on defence. Where can it come from? Very difficult. It has to be, well, obviously extra taxation or cuts. Where do you cut?
I don't believe that the German armed forces are ready to carry out what's required. And now all of this has to be made up for. And that is expensive.
We completely agree that the Europeans are now arming themselves. Maybe they'll even manage to create a joint army, but that will take years.
Well, Victor Ash is the former United States ambassador to Poland. I asked him what he made of this European defence meeting.
Well, I think it's a critical, very important, and hopefully the European nations there can unify and overwhelmingly, if not unanimously, reach a decision. President Trump has made his decisions. I personally disagree and regret them. And you have to wonder what's coming down the road. Is NATO next?
What's the answer to your question? Is NATO next?
Well, I don't know. I'm not privy to President Trump's thoughts, but he certainly made critical comments. Now, I would say he's on track in terms of NATO countries putting more money up for the defense and for the NATO budget. Poland, for example, has been a country that has done quite a bit. The UK, under the leadership of Prime Minister Starmer, is moving ahead, and Germany may be too. But it's important that everyone pitch in and do what they should, whether the U.S. is involved or not.
Do you think European countries are up to the job to quickly get this done?
They're up to it and can do it if they have the will to do it. I cannot answer that. I mean, individual leaders, President Macron of France and others, has been, and the British Prime Minister certainly, and King Charles, to the degree the king can be involved in political events are clearly on board. But are the other countries? And I don't know the answer to that yet.
You're a seasoned observer of international events. This meeting in Brussels is being described as a critical turning point in Europe's defence. Do you see it like this? Is this one of those huge change moments?
I think it's a very pivotal meeting. It may not be the pivotal meeting, but it may very well go down in history, just as Churchill's speech in 1947 went down in Westminster, Missouri, about the Iron Curtain. It may be a meeting that is remembered, 60 years later.
President Trump keeps on changing his mind 24 hours after making a decision about, for instance, car tariffs today. He's flip-flopped on the decision he made yesterday. It is just possible, is it not, that he's going to change his mind on this, isn't it?
Certainly. It's an open book. He flips the pages frequently, and there's no real consistency. And he said, the number one goal he would be to reduce inflation and reduce prices. And he's taken steps that does the exact opposite. With Mexico and Canada, needless fights with countries that have been traditionally our longtime friends. And then he backs off every 30 days, literally on the eve of the day they are to be implemented.
You know from your time working in Europe that Germany is the engine of Europe. Germany has now agreed to loosen its borrowing limits to boost its defence spending. Could this signal a broader shift perhaps in Europe's willingness to heavily invest in its military capabilities?
Oh, definitely. I mean, if Germany is isolated and not contributing, and it's one of the most significant countries in Europe, obviously that's a step back. But this is a step forward under the new leadership in Germany, and perhaps in a bipartisan way with what will be the ruling coalition in the German parliament. And I think that sends a signal. And the major countries in Europe will seem to be on board, and then the smaller countries, which are still very important, hopefully will join up.
You spent a lot of your life in Europe. You're clearly back home in the States. How would you describe the current state of European-US relations? This was once your job. You were the face of America in Poland. How do you see it now?
Well, I think it's at risk, and I hope Europeans realize that a great deal of the American public are very supportive of close ties between the United States and Europe. And, of course, so many Americans are immigrants from Europe, one country or another, some going back 200 years. But that's who we are. And I think the current Trump administration hopefully it is one that'll get its feet on the ground and be more realistic. But if it doesn't, in 3 years and 10 months, they'll be gone.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Slamming on the brakes. President Trump pauses tariffs on car imports from Mexico and Canada a day after they were imposed.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The great transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
Well, China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us. And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliet Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
You might think you are better informed
informed in an information age. The fact is, people are more often misled by misinformation. You might think every voice is heard in a digital world. The fact is, many nations and peoples are still underrepresented. And data poverty shuts out many. We at CGTN are committed to transcending the information gap and the digital divide. CGTN, bridging nations and civilizations. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. The Trump administration has granted a one-month exemption from tariffs for car makers in Canada and Mexico.
This comes after 25% tariffs were imposed on all imports this week, sparking concerns about a trade war. President Trump is demanding both countries tighten their borders to fight drugs and migrant flows into the United States.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent Nick Harper in Washington. So, Nick, what's behind this decision from President Trump to temporarily pause these tariffs?
Well, Robin, I think it simply comes down to a realisation from the United States that what has been put in place is going to backfire, that it is going to hurt US car manufacturers and it is going to hurt US consumers who are buying those cars. So there is this 1 month reprieve that's now been put in place for the three big US automakers, General Motors, Ford and Stellantis. Now, many of them have factories outside of the United States in their nearest neighbouring countries, in Canada and Mexico, and they also import parts from both of those countries. In terms of the statistics, about 70% of all cars made in Canada and Mexico are actually bought here in the United States. So the big three car makers in the US rely on their neighbouring countries really to get the final product created. And it's thought that often with these cars being made and manufactured, the parts that go into them or the cars themselves will cross border lines about 8 times before they end up on the forecourt for American people to be able to buy. And of course, if there is a 25% tariff, each one of those 8 times that it's crossing the borders, the costs mount very, very quickly, costs that would likely be passed on to US consumers. So as a result, there is this reprieve. It's only a month long at this stage, but there could, of course, be the possibility, with Donald Trump seemingly changing his mind day by day, that that gets extended longer.
Well, with that in mind, Nick, what might we expect next?
Well, Robin, we've been hearing from the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, over the last couple of hours, and he is suggesting that there could be even more changes to come. A suggestion being that there would be a 1 month pause, like with cars, on any goods that are being transported from Canada and Mexico. So anything that's covered by the USMCA trade agreement, which is essentially every single good that enters from Canada or Mexico into the United States. Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, suggesting there could be a 1 month pause. And we've heard reaction from the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, saying that these comments are a promising sign, but also saying that he's in discussions to delay a second round of Canadian retaliatory tariffs, but remaining firm that he intends to keep his current retaliatory tariffs in place until the United States formally lifts all tariffs against Canada. We also know that there is a phone call set up for at some point today with the Mexican president and Donald Trump. Claudia Sheinbaum, of course, hoping to convince the US president to drop tariffs against her country. It is a wait-and-see type approach, but literally day by day, things are changing and moving very quickly. By the end of today, we could have more news and potentially more reprieves. Robin?
Nick Harper in Washington, thank you very much.
Well, let's take you to New York and talk to our correspondent there, Mitch McCann. Mitch, we've heard about the politics there and we've heard about the diplomacy. Let's talk the money. How's the stock market reacting to this tariffs pause?
Well, good morning, Jamie. The stock market here in New York is down this morning. As we've talked about, it's been a very turbulent month since Donald Trump was elected to office on the 20th of January after it was announced on Wednesday that Donald Trump was pausing those tariffs on auto companies for a month that Nick just talked about. Wall Street actually rallied to make up from some of the major losses that it saw on Tuesday. At the closing bell yesterday, the Dow Jones had climbed almost 700 points, the S&P 500 was up 1%, and the Nasdaq was up slightly as well at the closing bell. Now, all of those stocks I've just mentioned are actually down this morning. The Dow Jones has slid 218 points just looking at this now. The S&P 500 is down almost 1%, and the Nasdaq is down just over 1%. And these results this morning may be for a number of reasons. One is the confusion over the back and forth nature of these tariffs and the suggestion that putting a pause on the auto tariffs will only bring short-term relief. I saw one quote here in the US this morning for an analyst on CNBC. He said exempting automakers for just 1 month from these draconian tariffs is like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, given the torrent of trade tariff announcements planned by the White House in the coming months. And the other reason the indices that we're looking at this morning are down is because of a jobs report that came out from the company Challenger Gray and Christmas here in the US, based in Chicago. That's a company that helps Americans find work when they're unemployed. It reported that US employers saw 127,000 layoffs last month. That is up 245% from January and the highest figure since the COVID-19 pandemic. So if there was ever clear data about economic uncertainty ahead of us, that just might be it.
Mitch, we've been preoccupied with watching this car tariff story from Canada and Mexico. Let's just talk about farming for a second, because it's also being reported that President Trump is looking at the farming, the agricultural sector, and could pause tariffs there too. Are we seeing any movement on those stocks?
We are actually. We're seeing some movement from major agricultural stocks this morning. Bloomberg, as you mentioned, Jamie, is reporting that as well as an exemption for the auto industry, Donald Trump may now be considering tariff relief for the agricultural industry. Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins said in an interview this morning that everything is on the table and that she is hopeful that the administration could decide on providing relief to the sector. She said she trusts Donald Trump's leadership on this. And if we look at some of the major agricultural stocks this morning, CF Industries, which is a major fertilizer company, its stock is almost up 2% this morning. Archer Daniels Midland, that is a food processing company, that is also up around 2%. And the chemical and seed company, Corteva, is up around 0.3% this morning. So agricultural companies up slightly in the hope that they will also get a reprieve like the auto companies. Donald Trump is due to sign executive orders at 2 o'clock Eastern time here in the US this afternoon, and it's possible he'll let reporters into the room and hold one of these impromptu press conferences like he has been in recent weeks. So we actually might find out more information around that in about 3 hours from now.
Mitch, thanks for that. Our correspondent Mitch McCann in New York.
Well, while President Trump might have the backing of his Republican lawmakers in Washington, some of their constituents are rather more anxious about the effect of US tariffs close to home.
Our correspondent Owen Fairclough reports.
A rapturous reception for Donald Trump as he laid out his agenda before a Congress controlled by his Republicans.
Our new trade policy will also be great for the American farmer. I love the farmer.
Marking a presidency that is upending just about every alliance and partnership, including with America's top 3 trading partners, Mexico, Canada and China, all of them hit with tariffs.
But if those Republican lawmakers are cheering on Capitol Hill, they also have to answer to constituents far away from Washington, D.C., some of whom are not sharing the exuberance.
Long before Trump's address, farmers were counting their losses from avian flu ravaging poultry stocks across the U.S.
The eggs are like gold right now.
Followed by uncertainty over Trump's freezing of federal loans and grants farmers used to invest in their businesses. And now, steep rises in the cost of critical supplies imported from those big 3 trade partners, prompting Iowa Republican Senator Chuck Grassley to lobby in vain for an exclusion on Canadian potash, minerals used to fertilize one of America's most important farming states. And those farmers have been here before.
I have directed Secretary Perdue to provide $16 billion in assistance to America's farmers and ranchers.
Trump's first administration allocated a total of $28 billion in financial aid to offset the impact of tariffs he waged to try to protect U.S. businesses from foreign competition. Trump's now proposing $400 million in new aid, while urging farmers to pivot from exporting, even if it's financially painful.
The tariffs will go on agricultural product coming into America, and our farmers, starting on April 2nd, it may be a little bit of an adjustment period.
Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
German bonds have suffered their worst day since 1990. It comes after Berlin agreed an historic spending plan that will unlock hundreds of billions of dollars for defence and infrastructure investments. Well, our correspondent Trent Murray is in Berlin. So, Trent, what's going on with these bonds?
Hello there, Robin. That's right. We're witnessing the biggest jump in German government bond yields in some 35 years. As you say, back in 1990 was the last time we saw this volatility, around the time of German reunification. Now, this really has come after the cost of borrowing in Germany rose following that announcement from Friedrich Merz to pump hundreds of billions of dollars into the German economy, focusing, of course, on infrastructure and defence. Now, that money, that effectively, the unleashing of Germany's financial firepower has caused bond prices to fall. Bond prices and yields move in opposite directions, meaning that the yields will climb higher when the value of the bond falls. And that is what we are seeing. Effectively, the cost of borrowing now for the German government will be much higher. And of course, there's really sort of two schools of thought on what this could mean for the economy. The first is if they are taking on new debt, which is what we believe they will do based on this infrastructure plan, higher volumes of debt at higher rates of interest could really hurt the budget. The other school of thought, though, is that by pumping all of this money in, there will be an economic benefit. But this is certainly a pretty big moment, and we know that the debt asset class market globally is being affected by this. Germany, of course, is the world's third biggest economy. What happens here does have an impact. We're seeing a bit of a ripple-on effect now globally. Japan's government bond yields are at a 10-year high. Similar effects happening in Australia, New Zealand, bonds up also in Italy. So this is certainly one to watch. It's one investors will be watching very, very closely, and I imagine it'll be one Friedrich Merz, the likely incoming chancellor, will be also watching, given the effect it could have on his incoming government and its budgetary and economic plans.
And Trent, the German economy perhaps a factor in the European Central Bank's latest interest rate decision.
Yeah, the market had largely priced in this rate cut today. The key deposit rate now 2.5% across the 20 countries that use the euro, part of the Eurozone. This is the sixth cut we have seen. I think it's a signal from the bank that they believe inflation is getting under control, but they're also believing the rates now are a bit too high still, which could be causing economic contraction or sort of just keeping the brakes a bit on the Eurozone economy. Christine Lagarde had an interesting tone today because while she was talking about the fact that they have downgraded their growth forecast this year in 2025, 0.9% is now the new figure. She also signalled that there is just so much uncertainty right now, particularly out of the United States and this looming trade war, which of course many investors in Europe are concerned about. Let's just have a listen to a little bit of what the President of the ECB, Christine Lagarde, had to say during that press conference in Frankfurt.
We know that tariffs, and particularly if there is retaliation, are not good at all and are net negative on pretty much all accounts. And it's even negative before it happens, because the uncertainty that is generated and the undermined confidence that results from just the threat.
And uncertainty there was the key word of the day, I think, from Christine Lagarde, trying to really understand how these tariffs could redirect trade flows for Eurozone countries. Of course, the other question, which we always ask at these moments once a month at the ECB, is could there be another rate cut? The next meeting will be in April. She was tight-lipped on that, saying, once again, the bank will be data-driven in the decisions that it makes. But certainly I think the signal today from the ECB is that there is just real uncertainty looming over the Eurozone as a whole.
Trent, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Trent Murray in Berlin.
You can get highlights from the week's news in Europe and China direct to your inbox from CGTN Storyboard email newsletter. Sign up at europe.cgtn.com/newsletter.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. President Trump tells Hamas to free all hostages or not a single member of the Palestinian group will be safe.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and the bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The green transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
Well, China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us. And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliet Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories: a financial injection for the tech sector, inviting more foreign investment. China sets out plans to fire up its economy.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky joins an emergency EU summit to discuss an $840 billion plan to boost defence.
And President Trump pauses tariffs on Canadian and Mexican car makers a day after the 25% levy was imposed.
US President Trump has told Hamas to free all hostages or not a single member of the Palestinian group will be safe. Trump made the comments after hosting freed Israeli hostages in the White House.
His ultimatum comes as the White House confirms US officials held secret talks with Hamas. Washington designated the group a terrorist organization back in 1997.
Well, the Palestinian group Hamas has rejected that ultimatum from President Trump and said he's encouraging Israel to back out of the second stage of the ceasefire deal.
At the same time, Israel's blockade of all humanitarian aid from entering Gaza continues. Our correspondent Rami Al-Magari reports now from Khan Yunis.
The people in Gaza have been reacting as sort of downplaying the remarks because they are saying, as we have spoken to many of them, they are saying that they are determined, steadfast in their land, and they are not going to leave the land at any rate, because you know that 15 months of a devastating Israeli war against the Gaza Strip has already put the population of Gaza into an unprecedented situation of displacement, starvation, deprivation, loss of lives. 60,000 have been lost and more than 100,000 others have been injured. The homes have been battered. So the majority of the homes have been battered and destroyed because of the war. Now the people, many of them are homeless. So whatever President Trump says about the forcible immigration or forcible displacement of Palestinians is not finding listening ears or listening minds. Actually, they are steadfast on their lands. That's the reaction. Hamas today, for example, which is very involved in this kind of controversy and kind of rhetoric, actually has already stated that instead of threatening for the Palestinians that they are going to be forced out. The American administration should make sure that Israel goes into the second phase of the truce deal with Hamas and implement the second phase of the truce towards the end of the war against the Gaza Strip.
Well, Hamas leaders and mediators from Egypt and Qatar have reportedly held talks to try to repair a fractured ceasefire deal between Israel and the Palestinian group.
President Trump's envoy is said to have been in attendance. Our correspondent Jonathan Regeb is in Tel Aviv.
What is the policy? Is it the very threatening message coming from President Trump last night, or actually the direct negotiations, which are very unprecedented, as was just mentioned, between the United States and a group which is designated by Washington as a terror group? And then we're hearing reports today that there have been some progress in talks regarding the second phase. But on the other hand, the U.S. telling Israel, do not go into the second phase, but actually stick with a plan by Steve Witkoff. So a lot of confusion here in Israel. Not exactly, no one really understands what is exactly the path that the United States is going through. There are reports surfacing just in the last few minutes that the United States has offered Hamas some kind of an extension of the ceasefire, 2 more months of extension in return for the release of 10 living hostages. No confirmation from the U.S., from Hamas, clearly not from Israel, as Israeli officials simply do not know what to think. What is the American approach for the moment? No comment also from Israel regarding the report that Hamas and the United States have held a direct negotiations. We can only imagine what would have happened if this would have happened during the Biden administration. That would have led to major criticism here in Israel with the Trump administration, following what we saw with President Zelensky a week ago. But not only that, I think Israeli officials are much more careful. The Trump administration has been able to deliver a ceasefire agreement with hostage release so far. This is what Israel is hoping for, an extension of the ceasefire and the release of more hostages. But eventually, no one really knows what is the path that Washington is looking for.
As we've been hearing, the Israeli aid blockade into Gaza is now in its 5th day, triggering international warnings of a deeper humanitarian crisis. Our correspondent Nadra Al-Tibi reports.
Some Gazan families have returned to Khan Younis, setting up tents in the Al-Mawasi area. Here many feel the trauma of what has transpired not only over the past 2 years, but for decades. Hussam Abu Shawarib, a father of 7, has returned to what was once a place called home. The destruction reminds him and his family of the early days of displacement, a time they feared total war would break out.
We're lost. We don't know whether this is really a truce or not. We returned to Rafah, but were prevented from entering most of the area. We had asked before we went anywhere else if it was allowed or not. We were in a state of total insecurity, so we were forced to return to Khan Younis.
With the cessation of a humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip following Israel's closure of crossing points, UNICEF has warned of dire consequences for children and families in Gaza who are struggling to survive.
The impact of the halting of aid going into Gaza on families in Gaza cannot be overstated. The humanitarian crisis inside Gaza has continued despite the ceasefire taking effect on January 19th, and families are in need of literally everything. So the consequences of the aid stopping will be devastating, especially for children.
Although the aid doesn't meet people's basic needs and barely reaches them, its cessation leads to a serious deterioration in food security, which is already faltering in Gaza.
We've been afraid ever since the crossing was closed. I want to provide food for my children, so I've started looking for rice, sugar, and flour. Prices have now doubled. We're relying on food aid, and it's difficult for us to lose access to it. We're afraid that we'll reach the stage of hunger, and our children will be deprived of food.
Since the January 19 ceasefire, 7,080 trucks have entered the Gaza Strip, carrying a total of 130,000 tons of aid, including 20,000 tents. As displacement of Palestinians continues, there are renewed fears that another famine will strike the Gaza Strip if a crossing remains closed and if humanitarian aid fails to reach to the people in need. There are also concerns that the current ceasefire may not hold much longer. Nadira Tibi, CGTN, Gaza.
South Korea's Air Force has apologized after 8 bombs were accidentally dropped on a village close to the border with the DPRK. 15 people were injured when the missiles were mistakenly released from a fighter jet. It happened during a routine training exercise with the US military, leaving houses and a church damaged. Pilot error has been blamed.
Australia has cancelled flights and closed schools on the country's east coast before the arrival of Cyclone Alfred. The Category 2 storm is expected to make landfall near Brisbane, bringing heavy rain, flooding and strong winds. It's apparently a very rare event for the city. It was last hit by a cyclone half a century ago.
Portugal's Prime Minister has called for a confidence vote in his government. It follows accusations of conflict of interest levelled at Luis Montenegro over his links to a consultancy firm he founded. He denies any wrongdoing. If he loses, it will trigger Portugal's third election in 4 years.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, why when it comes to next generation artificial intelligence and robotics, it's all about the wires.
Today, China makes 2 out of every 3 of the world's electric vehicles.
The arguments about whether the future is electric are basically non-existent anymore.
What seemed like a blink of an eye, things changed.
The Chinese, they have a 30% cost competitive edge in their sourcing compared to ours.
We must defend ourselves against unfair practices.
We do oppose tariffs. We don't think that's the right measure.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. The internal combustion engine shaped our world for over a century, but its reign is slowly coming to the end of the road. As the electric vehicle revolution accelerates, legacy car makers face something of an existential crisis. We've been talking to industry experts about the emotional and the economic challenges of transitioning to electric.
This is an internal combustion engine from 1886. It really is an early example of a technology that has fundamentally shaped our world over the last 130 years. But that history is now coming to a close, and a new future is being written. For legacy car makers in Europe and elsewhere, they're struggling to find their place in it. Some say they've been complacent because the glamour attached to their design history has sustained demand. True or not, there has been widespread emotional resistance to abandoning storied European brands and their noisy internal combustion engines. Do you think we'll see the collapse of one of the legacy car makers in the near future, and what do you think that would...
I mean, it's very sad. I think it's inevitable. I don't think in the near future those companies are so enormous and so entrenched that it will take a while, but I think it's inevitable that if they don't adapt, then they just can't. You know, the arguments about whether the future is electric are basically non-existent anymore. It's boring. Who cares? You know, the future is electric. Electric motors are just, as a machine, they are so much more efficient. And if it's okay with people to import toxic fossil fuel that costs a lot of money and then refine it and then transport it and then put it in a car and then burn it once for a few thousandths of a second, and then it turns into a gas that's toxic. If that's okay, then I won't argue with you. You know, but I think the arguments against that old technology now are overwhelming.
And you can see more of our documentary, Shocking the System, Why China is Winning the EV Race, on Sunday at 16:30 GMT here on CGTN or cgtn.com.
Shares in Alibaba have risen 8% in Hong Kong after the company announced its latest artificial intelligence model. A snappily titled QWQ-32B is touted as outperforming rivals ChatGPT and China's DeepSeek. Alibaba says the new AI has 32 billion parameters and has demonstrated capabilities in mathematical reasoning, coding and general problem solving.
The UK has dropped its investigation into Microsoft's partnership with OpenAI. The regulators say the software giant does not exert enough control over the company to warrant any further investigation. Microsoft initially invested $1 billion in OpenAI back in 2019, but the deal came under antitrust scrutiny in the UK and the US.
Japan's 7&I Holdings has hired its first foreign CEO as the owner of the 7-Eleven chain fends off a $47 billion takeover bid. Stephen Dacus, who will take control at the end of May, is tasked with fighting off the takeover and turning around declining sales. The restructuring also includes a $13 billion share buyback scheme and an IPO of its American unit.
Denmark's state-run postal service is stopping all letter deliveries by the end of this year after 400 years. PostNord, which also operates in Sweden, says it's cutting 1,500 jobs and removing Danish postboxes, citing a 90% drop in letters since the start of the century. Letter deliveries will continue as usual in Sweden.
Artificial intelligence and robotics are centre stage at the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona. Those technologies could be transformed by next-generation microchips and cabling.
Our correspondent Ken Brown reports.
Yes, a Formula One car is fast, but it's not a patch on what happens inside these. This brand new hollowed-out fibre optic cable allows data to move faster than the speed of light, enabling the AI revolution. Without these submarine fibre optic wires, you wouldn't even receive a WhatsApp. Chinese company YOFC is constantly working on next-gen cabling and delivers this essential tech in over 100 countries.
We have the vision to connect every corner of the world by optic fiber. So that's our commitment, our vision. So that's very crucial for artificial intelligence. So that's the reason we call it next generation optic fiber.
Unveiling its brand new innovations at the Mobile World Congress, its cables can be laid up to 8,000 meters under the sea. Back on dry land, Longsys is a Shenzhen-based memory tech and microchip maker that helps run smartphones, wearables, and even entire data centers. They are gearing up to meet the demands of the AI boom.
We have invested a lot, continue to invest a lot on R&D and the production manufacturing side in the past years. So we're ready to enhance this huge opportunity with our technology-leading products.
The next giant leaps in artificial intelligence demand the greatest scale-up in power generation that the world has ever seen, driving blindingly fast innovation in microchips that are bringing us ever closer to the mind-blowing potential of quantum computing and all the possibilities that will bring. ChatGPT, DeepSeek, AI-powered robot butlers, pilotless flying cars, none of it works without the microchips and the crucial cables beneath our feet, helping us take to the skies.
Our correspondent Ken Brown reporting from Barcelona. The headlines again, a financial injection for the tech sector inviting more foreign investment. China sets out its plans to fire up its economy.
While we've been on air, the Trump administration has announced that Mexico won't pay tariffs on any goods that fall under an existing trade agreement until April. It comes after the president paused tariffs on Canadian and Mexican car makers.
And German bonds suffer their worst day since 1990 as the incoming chancellor says he'll increase defence spending.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
Coming up next on CGCN is Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.